Cool. Thank you, Hannah. Hope you guys had a nice lunch and are ready to listen to some AI governance talks. So Morgan and I will be talking about what we've been working on this summer. So I am a CERI fellow and Morgan's been working with GovAI in Oxford. So he came over here for this presentation. Thank you, Morgan. But today we'll be talking about our project, which is looking at case studies and specifically how we can look at these industry relevant case studies and apply what we've learned into the AI ecosystem. So I'll kind of break this down into a bit further. So if we look at the title, blah, 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 industry level. Beautiful. As you obviously couldn't find those words on the slide, now they're in yellow, so now you can find them. Industry-led basically means it's something that the industry themselves are initiating. So we're not waiting for states to initiate any policies. We're actually waiting, or we're watching as the industry themselves are saying, hey, this is something we need to regulate. Hey, maybe we should be looking at safety regulations and standards. Second part of our project is looking at safety critical technologies. So AI has been, as you can tell, especially in terms of long-term AI, it's been identified as a safety critical technology because of its effect on if it goes wrong or if it goes well, it will affect pretty much everyone in the world and it will have large scale economic events and outputs. So we're looking at technologies that are of similar magnitude and similar scale. So we'll kind of be going over mainly where our report rests in the whole AGI governance ecosystem. So that's the first part on the motivation there. Second part, we'll kind of be looking at what were our two key questions that we were trying to answer with this project. We'll dive into kind of the actual grit of it with our case studies. So we chose 3 industries and we're going to kind of go over them very briefly, what we kind of learned from each of those. And then we'll kind of wrap that up. How do we expand this, what we've learned into the general AI ecosystem? So looking into the first part, motivation, why A, do we want to do this? And B, in this entire AI governance ecosystem, where does our work kind of stand? So first point is the industry-led part. Why do we want it to be industry-led? And the key important part about this is that likely any significant developments we'll be seeing in the next decade or so are going to be from industry. And that's simply because states right now are just significantly lagging behind what industry is doing in terms of technology, competence, and capital invested in this technology. And another important reason is that it is much easier to coordinate amongst several key actors. So if we look at coordination between, let's say, DeepMind, OpenAI, and a couple of other key actors, it's much more easy to do than to get, say, all of the states who are interested in AI to coordinate. So with these two ideas in mind, we're going to be focusing on industry-led efforts specifically. The second part, as I mentioned before, is that it has this safety critical element. And the whole part about this is that AI, as with any of the technologies we'll be talking about, like aviation and nuclear energy, these are things that if they went wrong, people's lives are at risk. There's big economic payouts that you would have to do if things went wrong. So we're looking at it from this perspective. An important part we also wanted to look at are sort of what are the key questions if you are an important person in one of these labs today at, let's say, OpenAI or DeepMind, what are some of the questions and what are some of the decisions you would need to be making? And the reason we're looking at this is because the timelines in industry are just much shorter than if we had to go through all of this levels of regulation in states. So that's why we're looking at specifically what are questions industry people can be asking rather than state-led people. Fourth part, as I mentioned, what is the importance of case studies? Well, a lot of industries, as much as we like to think that AI is this completely novel thing, well, there's been other industries that have had to deal with safety critical technologies as well. And so there's a lot we can learn from them based on what went well for them, what didn't go well. Did they have to create a regulating body or did they just create conferences and this sort of thing? So kind of learning from their history, maybe mistakes or anything, and we can hopefully try to avoid those. So kind of motivation for our project right there. Morgan's going to quickly talk about the 2 main projects. 2 main questions.
Cool. Thanks, Yilin. So these were the central questions we were investigating for our reports. Sort of want to preface these by going into a bit of detail on how we find these questions. I think if you want your research to be decision relevant, you need to have a clear sense of what decisions are going to be made and what timelines those are going to be made at in the case of each actor. So if you're focusing on governments, you want to be thinking about which reports are going to come out, which decisions are going to be made. For us, industry actors, I think it's particularly difficult to get an intuition or a good sense of what research is decision relevant for these actors? I think probably the best outcome we have for this is we wrote down a list of things that intuitively felt pretty reasonable to us, and then we sent these to people we know working at safety conscious labs, some of our supervisors, and got them to note, oh, this is particularly interesting. This is like relevant to some decisions we're going to make soon. This is relevant to a sort of broader series of reports they're writing, and then sort of went from there. Yeah, in that vein, we have two central investigation questions. Which mechanisms catalyzed industry-led governance efforts in each case study for our 3 case studies? And then how did efficacy of safety assurance evolve over time? Cool. Yeah, and a sort of different level of granularity. Essentially, we looked at when there was a big change in industry behavior, or when there was a sort of instance of industry governance in each particular case study, what led to that, and what sort of effects led from that. Some other interesting sort of insights or questions we discussed, partly on the basis of conversations with people working at the labs, with these sort of regulatory capture, other forums and conferences that were relevant there. So here are 3 case studies. We'll go commercial aviation, gene synthesis, nuclear energy. Rough timeline, won't go into much detail because of time constraints. Essentially, aviation has become really very dramatically safe since it first started. This is mostly a sort of US-centered and an international history of aviation regulation. Yeah, at the very start, the US government was playing such a big role, and sort of some of the first safety assurance was as part of the AML service. As we go on a little bit further, you see the role of the US government changing as a sort of relative value to the aviation industry changes. You see deregulation in the middle, and then a sort of more integration with other data streams towards the end. So in this first column, we've got a very rough table of sort of our expectations of how most of industry governance goes in aviation. You see accidents driving public and Congress to influence or form committees, which in turn sort of affect the FAA or another regulatory body, which then influences industry. And then these 2 dotted arrows are for regulatory capture, because these intersections are messy and industry has some effect of this too. Safety assurance, a bunch of insights, won't focus too much on these. Yeah, some interesting stuff, I guess, is, yeah, the size of the industry has really changed. It's grown much bigger than the sort of regulatory capacity. In line with this, regulatory bodies have had to leverage their resources in smarter ways, in different ways, to increase their safety oversight. And one big part of that is sort of utilizing industry to itself conduct a lot of the oversight and regulation there. Yilin will take over for gene synthesis.
Cool. So kind of there's some similarities, but some key differences between those 2. So I'll kind of highlight those. Maybe that's interesting to note. So for genetic synthesis, we're kind of looking at the period around the 70s and beyond, from when it first started looking into deep diving into gene synthesis. And I think, so timeline, and then maybe I'll compare it to aviation a little bit. So we started first seeing these like what they call like the true gene synthesis by doing like gene splitting in the late 60s, 1960s. We had the first biological weapons convention in 1972. So this was already quite early on. However, many people have noted that this convention in general had pretty vague outlines. And the main problem was that they didn't have actual mechanisms to check these labs. So I think this is actually quite analogous to our situation right now with AGI, where we don't actually have mechanisms to properly verify certain models and what certain labs are doing. So this is a pretty interesting analogy there. We see a couple of years later, they start having these conferences. These are largely actually spurred. So the ASLOMR conference was spurred by very concerned researchers. So a key difference is, unlike aviation, where we often had big accidents and people were like, oh, maybe we should take care about this. This never really happened. It was just rather people who were doing this research, and they decided this was something they needed to focus on. So this is actually if you look at the first point, this researcher, Berg, paused his own research because he was thinking, if this goes wrong, it could go very wrong. So these are researchers who are very foresighted, and they're looking at what could go wrong in the future. Another interesting thing I found particularly interesting was that there were creations of certain committees and certain groups looking to control the safety of these technologies, and they were actually dismantled later on. So I think this is similar as well to this idea of deregulation, because in this case, there were some pressures where the US wasn't regulating something, the UK was, and then the UK government was like, hey, listen, our industry is going to lag behind. We should stop regulating this as well. So there's kind of these tensions there. This largely happened in the 80s, became deregulated. And then in around 2009 or so, a new sort of consortium was created. And important to note that these are largely voluntary for industry. So if we look at the next sort of similar thing, you don't have to look in too detail into what's actually written. I'm kind of going to walk you through this idea, but it's basically that like these groups created, so advancements in the technologies led to people who are in research positions to be concerned, which led to them notifying national boards. This could either be national boards on the government level, or a lot of people also published like letters to Science magazine, and then the community as a whole got alerted of these. This then got brought to certain committees who were created, and then they created certain governing bodies. But there's arrows going back and forth because they were created and then dismantled. And an important thing is that whenever industry got involved with this, it was always done voluntarily. So for these national boards, they could control how much research was being done simply based on funding. So if they thought something was potentially not as safe as it could be, they would just cut funding. And that was a mechanism they could use. But for private industry, this was not something they could do. So this was something really that they had to depend on industry being aligned with them. So I thought that was quite interesting and pretty analogous to our situation now. And I think my key takeaway from this also is that even if we can get regulation in, it doesn't mean that it'll stay. And that's maybe a good thing if the regulation needs to be updated, but also maybe dangerous. If we do get regulation in, it can still be deregulated later on. So something to note from there. I'll pass back to you for nuclear.
Thank you. Yeah, very brief overview of nuclear regulation, mostly in the US and internationally again. Started out with a complete prohibition of commercial applications of nuclear technologies in 1946. Then, due to sort of fears of the Soviet Union pushing ahead with commercial nuclear technologies, the US opened up a lot more and started actively fostering and supporting the civil nuclear capacities. Formation of the IAEA is a really important moment, partly because the sort of very comprehensive safeguarding apparatus. I'm sure if people have looked into nuclear weapons, they're familiar with that. I think the formation of the NRC is particularly interesting as well, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because before this, the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, was sort of wearing two hats: develop the domestic nuclear capability and at the same time assure safety. Here's an important split where the NRC is mostly focusing on safety, and that's for mostly domestic reasons. And 3 Mile Island accident, not very deadly or dangerous in the sense of Chernobyl or Fukushima, but still like really important in driving US regulatory policy. And then certainly not the end of the nuclear story, but an important end of the this era of sort of US regulatory changes, a nuclear revival, sort of taking back contracts in the 2000s. Again, very similar to aviation, we have accidents and fears guiding fears in the public and the Congress, and this leading to changes in the AEC and NRC, and then again feeding down to industry. Yeah, a lot of content in a case study, but I'll sort of point to some interesting dynamic that stands out to me here. Because this is a sort of directly analogous to AI situation, there was a moment where the reactor technology for nuclear energy was pretty uncertain. The US Atomic Energy Commission didn't want to stifle development, but wanted to assure safety. Instead of sort of writing a very rigid checklist of specifications that nuclear energy companies would have to fit to, they instead had broader principles, and they had each energy company write them a long report describing how safety would be assured. This changed as reactor safety was a bit more certain, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had a sort of instead one-step procedure lots of specification, lots of rigidity. Yeah, sort of both approaches seem challenging and interesting for AI case. So we wanted to start with some questions for you, and then also some sort of adjacent projects we're sort of interested in, think might be valuable. Yeah, unless you've got any comments, we can probably pass over to the audience. Thanks.